And now we indeed go to the superstar keynote speaker. He is a professor, a chair in machine learning and pattern recognition at the Imperial College in London, and also head of graph learning research at Twitter. Michael, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for these wonderful, kind words and the introduction and the invitation. So it's also great to see probably first event that is happening in person. Unfortunately, I'm joining, well, actually not from London, from Oxford here. Yeah, but happy to be.
All right.
Happy to be.
All right. Thank you very much for joining from Oxford Live. We agreed that you have a keynote presentation that takes 30 minutes and you share your slides with us. After that, we have a Q&A of 15 minutes. So if you have questions or comments during the presentation, please use the chat. And I now give the floor to Michael Bronstein.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So, yeah, I guess I need to deserve the applause, and the bar is very high. So I would like to talk about geometric deep learning. So it's probably not a new perspective, but maybe a reincarnation of some very old ideas that we have recently developed. And this is a work in collaboration with Joan Bruno, Petr Veličković, and Taco Cohen, who is actually a very local star. So he is himself a graduate of Max Welling's lab here in Amsterdam. And you can find more details at the website, geometricdeeplearning.com. So in order to understand at all why there is any relation between geometry and deep learning, allow me to take you back in history. And we're going 2000 years ago to the times of Euclid, who laid the foundations of geometry. And basically, since that time, there was no other geometry except what we call nowadays Euclidean geometry. But this picture changed rapidly in the 19th century with discoveries of what is now called non-Euclidean geometry, such as the work of Lobachevsky, that was probably initially derided and ignored. Gauss himself even entertained these ideas, but never published. János Bolyai, and then Bernard Riemann, Gauss's own PhD student, finally published a construction that is now called Riemannian geometry. So what happened then is that it led to a zoo of different geometries towards the late part of the 19th century. And it was not clear actually how to define a geometry and what constitutes maybe a more general geometry than another one. And it became quite an unhealthy situation until in 1872 came a young German mathematician called Felix Klein. So at the age of 23 years, he got an appointment as a full professor at the University of Erlangen in Bavaria in Germany. And as it was customary, probably also customary in the Netherlands, he was asked to present an inaugural talk and also publish a research prospectus, which entered the history of mathematics as the Erlangen program. And in this prospectus, he presented a radically new idea to approach the study of geometry as the study of symmetry or invariance. So he would look at certain properties of geometric shapes that would be preserved under certain class of transformations that were formalized using the language of group theory, which was also a new shiny mathematical tool to which Klein himself contributed. And this immediately gave clarity as to which geometry is more general and which geometry is contained as a particular subset of it. And it had a profound impact not only on geometry and mathematics, but also spilled into other fields, in particular the field of physics, where Emmy Noether proved a remarkable theorem that showed that in physical systems, you can derive conservation laws such as conservation of energy or conservation of momentum from first principles of symmetry, which was a remarkable result because before that, these conservation laws were purely empirical. You would observe them experimentally. And then through the notion of what is called gauge invariance, first introduced by Hermann Weyl, and then formalized and extended by Young and Mills. Young got the Nobel Prize in the 70s. It brought what we call the unification forces and what is nowadays, since the 70s, called the standard model of physics. So with the exception of gravity, this is all physics we currently know, and it can be entirely derived from symmetry. So here I'm quoting another Nobelist, Philip Anderson, that it's only slightly overstating the case to say that physics is the study of symmetry. So symmetry is really fundamental. And you may ask at this point, what does it all have to do with deep learning? So I think there are two links. First of all, same way as it happened in the 19th century, nowadays deep learning is everywhere, right? Like geometry was everywhere in the 19th century. But of course, it is no doubt, and well, we heard in the introduction in how many fields, even exotic ones like the applications in the Caribbean, machine learning has been used. But on the other hand, we also are now in an unhealthy situation when we have a lot of different models for different types of data or different applications, but we have very few unifying principles. And what we try to show in geometric deep learning is a kind of Erlangen program of deep learning, or Erlangen program of machine learning, some first principles that allow us to derive from the considerations of symmetry all the most popular architectures that currently exist. And it gives also a principled way to derive maybe the future architectures that might not exist today. And if you wonder what might be in the next decade beyond deep learning, hopefully these principles will survive longer than their particular implementations. So this is the main motivation, and I will try to showcase a few examples. So we popularized this term geometric deep learning in a paper that I co-authored with Joan Bruna, Jan LeCun, Arthur Schlam, and Pierre van der Geinst. It appeared in 2017 in the IEEE Signal Processing magazine. And nowadays it's used almost synonymously with graph neural networks, on which I will mainly focus this talk today. But as I hope to show you, this is part of a much broader picture. So if you look at the simple setting of supervised learning, it is essentially a function estimation problem, right? What we usually have, we are given some data set. So let's say our application is image classification. So we have examples of input images, let's say cats and dogs, and we have their labels. So what we try to do is we try to find a function from some hypothesis class that will fit well this training data. And what happened in the past decade is that we had huge data sets on which we can train sufficiently complex models. And these complex models have, at least in theory, the possibility to interpolate these data sets. And neural networks appear to be a suitable choice because, as we know, even with a simple configuration where you have just 2 layers in what is called the multi-layer perceptron, we can approximate any continuous function to any desired accuracy. This is called the universal approximation theory. So it's a set of results from mainly the 90s that show that these neural networks are potentially very expressive. The problem is that if we look at this problem from the perspective of approximation theory, the bounds or the results that exist there and existed probably for at least 100 years are not very useful and not very applicable to the machine learning settings where the data lives in very high dimensional spaces. So we can show in this example that, let's say that if we take even a very nice and regular function such as Lipschitz continuous function and we make it live in an n-dimensional space, the number of samples that we need to take in order to approximate it with a certain error epsilon grows exponential. So this is what is called the curse of dimensionality. And most of machine learning problems, as you probably know, they are not 2-dimensional or not 3-dimensional. How about thousands or millions of dimensions? So this is probably best seen in computer vision problems where even modestly sized images are very high dimensional, right? So these MNIST digit, it is something like 1,000-dimensional input vector. So of course, we can apply a simple perceptron to it by just parsing it to a vector and feeding it to the neural network. But the problem is that even if I shift the image just by 1 pixel, the input vector will change dramatically. And as a result, we'll need to give all the different shifted versions of the same digit for the neural network to learn that it should be classified in the same way. So this is typically known as data augmentation in deep learning. But of course, we see that this is hugely wasteful because in this example, there are some local regularities that we are completely throwing away. And the paradigm shift that happened in computer vision was inspired by works in neuroscience, the work of Hubel and Wiesel that discovered the local connectivity of the visual brain cortex in the human brain that was then implemented first in the neocognitron architecture of Fukushima, and of course the seminal convolutional neural networks of Jan LeCun and co-authors. But if we look at other kinds of data sets, such as this example from drug screening and drug discovery. So what you see here is a molecule. It is represented as a graph. So the nodes here represent atoms and the edges represent chemical bonds, right? So if you're particular interested, this is a molecule of the xanthine family, what is called a caffeine, that we're probably all very familiar with. So a common problem in drug discovery is you want to predict some physical or chemical properties of this molecule or other molecules. So for example, you want to predict its binding energy, right? If you want to bind it to a certain protein target, if you want to design a drug. And now, of course, you can take the properties of, say, let's say, the atoms or maybe the bonds and again, parse them into a vector and feed it into a neural network. But now you can see that we don't really have a canonical ordering of the nodes of the graph that models this molecule. So we have a completely different structure or completely different symmetry group, as we'll be describing in a few next few minutes. And molecular graphs are just one example of applications that need to deal with graph structured data. Another prominent application are social networks. So I work at Twitter. So there we deal with graphs that have hundreds of millions of nodes and billions of edges. In biology, again, in drug discovery, it is common to describe interaction of different biological and chemical entities in the body as interaction networks or interactomes. And you encounter really network data everywhere. So the question is how to approach it in a principled and mathematically correct way. So what we try to advocate with geometric deep learning is that these apparently dimensionality cursed problems of machine learning are not hopeless. And what we try to say is that we need to use stronger priors than just simple regularity of functions by looking at the domain that underlies our signal. So in the case of images, for example, this is a two-dimensional grid. So our data is not just a d-dimensional vector, it's a vector that comes from some underlying grid. And the structure of this grid can be described through a symmetry group, for example, the translation group. And then the action of this group on the domain is transformed through what is called the group representation and applied to the image in question. And if we incorporate this prior into the function that then operates on the signal, we can get a much better regularization and much better bounds and results in machine learning. So just to give this example more concrete, in case of a grid, we are talking about translational symmetry, and its representation is just the shift operator, about which we'll talk later. So the two particular kinds of properties that we can impose on the function that we apply to these images are what is called invariance and equivariance. So invariance means that if I apply the transformation, right, the group element to my image, I will not feel any difference. So a good example is object recognition. So no matter where the cat is located in the image, I still want to be able to classify it as a cat. The property of equivariance is slightly more subtle. So here we say that if I apply the transformation to the input, the output should be transformed in the same way. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it should be the same representation. It actually can be different, depends on the structure and dimensionality of the input and the output space. But here, for simplicity, think of this application that I'm trying to segment the cat. So the input and the output have exactly the same structure. And if I translate the image in the input, I want the output to be translated. So a good example of an equivariant function is actually a convolution. So it's not invariant, it is equivariant. Now, another prior that is actually very common in physics as well, and maybe we use it without really acknowledging it, is what is called scale separation. And roughly speaking, what it allows us to say is that if I look at the microscopic level, for example, at my environment, I will see quadrillions of molecules that are moving and colliding, right? And of course, I cannot model them. It would be intractable. So we need to get to a higher level of resolution and maybe model them statistically, thermodynamically, right? So there maybe I will have just a single parameter like temperature that allows to describe the behavior of the system. If I zoom out further to the planetary scale, I can basically collapse all this complexity of the Earth and its atmosphere into a single point, because the internal structure at that scale is irrelevant to describe the motion of Earth around the sun and other heavenly bodies, right? So the same thing can be applied to signals in machine learning. In particular, in images, we can apply what is called the coarse graining operator and do our problems at different scales. So this is very common in many machine learning problems, and in particular in image analysis, we can do a multi-resolution analysis. And this prior is usually manifested through what is called pooling. So you can see here a typical blueprint where we have our architecture that consists of layers that implement invariant or equivariant functions. So in convolutional networks, for example, the equivariant layer is the convolution. then the scale separation is addressed by local pooling, such as max pool. And then if our application requires a single readout, like in image classification, we'll apply some invariant function, such as sum of all the activations. And there are multiple domains on which you can apply these principles. So we call this the 5G of geometric deep learning, talking about grids, groups, graphs, geodesics, and gauges. So there are two different symmetries that you can look at when dealing with learning on manifolds. So probably I will not have time to talk about it today. I will mostly focus on graphs and grids. And what we also show is that you can derive most of the popular nowadays architectures, such as convolutional networks, group CNNs, deep set transformers, graph neural networks from the same principles. So you just choose the right symmetry property and apply it to the right domain and signals living on this domain. So this is what I would like to showcase today. And let me start with graphs. So a good metaphor for a graph is a social network. And we can think of the users in the network as nodes of the graph, and the edges model their social relations. And we can attach, for simplicity, d-dimensional feature vectors to the node that model, let's say, some demographic properties of the users. So one thing that you need to understand about graphs is that they don't really have a canonical ordering of nodes. So it's abstract topological objects, but it's convenient to order the nodes in a certain way because I can arrange the node features into a matrix, size n by d. N is the number of nodes, d is the dimensionality of each node feature vector. And we can also describe the structure of the graph through what is called the adjacency matrix. So it contains a 1 at the position ij if there is an edge between the respective nodes and 0 otherwise. Now, this arbitrarity of the ordering of the nodes means that I can permute these matrices in any arbitrary way, right? Basically, there is an inherent ambiguity in the choice of this ordering. And this P, the permutation matrix, is nothing else but the representation of the permutation group. That is the symmetry of the graph. That's exactly the implementation of our blueprint. The domain here is a graph or a set of nodes, and the symmetry structure is the permutation group. Now, if we want to learn or construct a function that is invariant to the permutation of the nodes, like if we want to, for example, to predict a property of a molecule, we don't care in which order we pass the atoms to our neural network. We want permutation invariant functions that look like this. If we want to, for example, detect, I don't know, malicious users on a social network, basically to do node-wise classification, we want, of course, the output to change in the same way as changing the order of the nodes. And in this case, we need to deal with permutation equivariant functions. So permutation equivariant functions will actually be typically the intermediate layers in a graph neural network, as convolutional layers are intermediate layers in CNNs. So there are multiple reasons why we cannot construct generic functions on graphs that have permutation equivariant structure. One of them is that the group is too large. It has n factorial elements, so it's super exponential. And so it is very common to work with local neighborhoods. So I look at a node, I look at its neighbors, and I take their features and collect them into what, technically speaking, is a multiset, because the features can appear more than once, even though the neighbor nodes are unique. And together with the feature vector of the node itself, we get basically this characterization of a neighborhood of a node on which we can apply a function. And I remind you that because we don't have really a canonical ordering of the neighbors, this function phi must be permutation invariant. So this is what is often called the local aggregator in graph neural networks. Now, if I apply the same function everywhere in the graph, I get this output, right, for every node of the graph. Basically, I have a new set of features that are obtained by somehow aggregating the features of the neighbors. And this function is permutation equivariant, right? If I change the order of the nodes, the output will change in the same way. Now, it appears that the choice of this function phi, the local aggregator, is extremely important. And it is possible to show that if it is chosen in an injective way, then the graph neural network of this type is equivalent to what is called the Weisfer-Element test in graph theory. So it's a classical work from Andrei Lemon and Boris Weisferer, two Russian scientists that were actually interested in the 60s in trying to classify different molecules. So actually, I titled the talk from Euclid to drug design, chemistry somehow is this connecting thread of a lot of modern machine learning techniques in this domain, because many graph neural networks, many of these architectures that are considered modern were actually invented completely independently, at least in the 90s, in the domain of chemical informatics. So there are deep roots and deep analogies between these methods in graph theory and machine learning on graphs that exist in computational chemistry. So what the Weisfeier element test tries to do is to determine whether two graphs are isomorphic, or in other words, if I can permute the nodes of one graph into another, preserving the connectivity. So there is an edge-preserving bijective map between these two graphs. And the way it goes, it's an iterative color refinement scheme. So it takes a graph and labels its nodes. First, all the nodes are labeled the same. So let's say blue label. And then it looks at the neighbors and their at the nodes and their neighborhoods, and tries to injectively map them into new labels. So here, initially, you can see that we have two types of neighbor. We have a blue node with 2 blue neighbors and a blue node with 3 blue neighbors. So these will become green and yellow. We can repeat this procedure again. Now we have 3 types of nodes. We have a green with 2 yellow neighbors. We have a yellow with 1 yellow and 2 green neighbors. And we have a green with 1 yellow and 1 green neighbors. So these become violet, red, and gray. But if I apply this procedure again, the labels don't change. So I stop and I output a histogram, a distribution of these labels, distribution of colors. And now if I take another graph and subject it to the same procedure, if I see that these histograms are different, I can say for sure that the graphs are non-isometric. Sorry, not isomorphic. But if the histograms are the same, we actually don't know. And in other words, it's a necessary but insufficient condition, and you can construct examples of graphs that are not isomorphic, but on which the WL test will produce the same output. So it is insufficient to determine whether graphs are isomorphic. Now, the same idea is implemented in graph neural networks. So this is how the typical aggregator will look like. So we have some permutation invariant aggregation. It's usually a sum or maybe a maximum or maybe an average. So it must be symmetric. So it must be insensitive to the order of the neighbors. And we have learnable function that transforms the features of the neighbors. And then some learnable aggregator that basically collides everything into a single vector. And this is how the new node feature is produced. And then we can apply it. We can apply multiple layers of this kind in sequence, and then get the output of the graph neural network. So there are several flavors to these architectures. There is a lot of nuances of how these functions are designed specifically. So this most common flavor is what is called a convolutional graph neural network. So in this case, we have aggregation weighted by coefficients that depend only on the structure of the graph. So you can think of it as a kind of importance of contribution of the jth node to the ith node of to the feature of the ith node. We can talk about attentional flavor. So I think the next talk will be about graph attentional networks. So in this case, we have aggregation with coefficients that depend on the features. And we, in the most general case, we can have a message passing architecture where you have a nonlinear function that transforms the features of node I and node j. So we can think of it as a message that is sent from a neighbor to the node itself by some nonlinear function. So again, if this is chosen in such a way that this function is injective, then we are completely equivalent to the Weisfeier-Lehmann test for the good and for the better. So we know exactly the expressive power of this graph neural network and what kind of tasks are unsolvable by these architectures. And you can see, hopefully, that graph neural networks are a particular instance of our geometric deep learning blueprint. This Weisfeier-Lehmann equivalent aggregation constructs permutation equivariant functions, and then we might have a final readout, which will be permutation invariant, and maybe also some local pooling and coarsening of the graph that can also be made learnable. So this will be implementing the idea of scale separation. Now, it is interesting to see at corner cases of graph neural networks, and one of them is a graph without any edges. So this is essentially a set. So sets inherit the same property of graphs of being arbitrarily ordered. And here we can do 2 extreme cases. One of them is to say that every node works on its own, so completely independent of others. We apply some shared function to each element in the set. And this is architecture that is called deep sets or point nets in computer graphics. It has become quite popular recently since the 2017 paper that described this architecture. Another kind of extreme case would be to say that every node can interact with any other node. So in this case, we have what is called a fully connected or complete graph. And in this case, you can actually see that the convolutional flavor doesn't work or makes no sense, because here everyone is connected to everyone. So this second argument of the function will be exactly the same for every node. So we need to use at least an attentional or maybe message passing flavor. And I hope that you can recognize the classical transformer architecture, right, which works exactly in this way. So you can interpret it as a kind of learnable adjacency, where the attention plays the role of the adjacency matrix of the graph that is learned from the data itself. And it has become extremely popular in machine learning tasks in natural language processing. I should say that, of course, where it is applied in natural language processing, we don't have completely arbitrary set of nodes. So we do have some sequence of nodes, right, or tokens in a text. So usually these positional information is conveyed by what is called positional encoding. So we have some extra features. Usually they look like sines and cosines in NLP applications. And this positional encoding has also been developed for graphs. There are multiple ways of doing it. You can use the eigenvectors of the Laplacian. We described a technique which we call graph subtraction networks. So we count some primitive structures such as triangles, cliques, or cycles, and we provide these counts as extra features to the neural network. So there is some pre-computational cost that might, in the worst case, be high, but the overall cost of the architecture, the computational complexity, is linear as in standard message passing. And we can show that it is actually strictly more expressive than the Weisfeiler-Lehmann graph isomorphism test by a choice of the appropriate substructure. And for example, talking about applications in drug discovery, we show that we can actually consider this as a kind of problem-specific inductive bias. So in organic chemistry, in molecules, it is very common to see these structures, as you see here in this molecule of caffeine rings. So these are cycles of length 5 or 6 in a graph. And if we incorporate this information in our graph neural network by counting these structures, we can see that we can get significantly better performance in predicting some properties of these molecules. So in this case, it was the property of the water solubility on the zinc dataset. So it's a toy example that contains molecules that are drug-like. So this is what often drug discovery people are looking at in predicting the properties of their potential candidates. So I should also say that nowadays there is a trend of decoupling the computational graph from the input graph. So we don't necessarily need to propagate messages on the same graph as that is provided as input. We can sample it. If the graph is very large, we can rewire it. And there are many reasons why you want to rewire the graph. One of them is information bottlenecks or oversquashing phenomena. And you can also use bigger filters that look not only on the immediate neighbors, but also the neighbors of the neighbors, what would correspond to multi-hop filters. It's interesting, actually, that in computer vision, the trend went into using many layers with smaller filters. Here, probably in graphs, we're trying to go towards less layers and bigger filters. So there is no complete analogy between CNNs and GNNs. It is also possible to learn the graph, optimal for the downstream task, and it's also possible not to keep always the same graph, but to update it between different layers. So there are several architectures of this kind. One of them we developed with colleagues from MIT, and what we call dynamic graph CNNs. And in maybe, again, historical perspective, we can relate it to manifold learning, where the idea is that you might have very high dimensional data, but it has some intrinsic low dimensional structure. And one way of looking at it is by looking at nearest neighbor graphs that capture this structure. So the idea of manifold learning is to try to do nonlinear dimensionality reductions, essentially embed these data set in a low dimensional space where it would be easier to do machine learning tasks, typically clustering. And the reason why these methods struggle to work in practical applications is that these steps of building the graph, doing the embedding, and then doing ML were separate stages. Nowadays, with geometric deep learning, we can give new life to these methods, or maybe interpret existing architectures as a kind of manifold learning by doing everything in the same end-to-end architecture, where we learn the graph that is optimal for the downstream task and learn the filters on this graph at the same time. So if you think of transformers, this is a classical example, right? So you can think of them as learning the right graph in the right way. And one of the applications, I think Martin mentioned healthcare in the beginning. This was a collaboration with colleagues from TUM, and we showed that these kind of architectures can be applied to real automatic diagnosis tasks. So here we're looking at neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer, and we significantly outperformed other architectures, including graph neural networks with handcrafted graphs. So I think I'm probably out of time, so let me jump directly to conclusions. And what I wanted to say is that basically these ideas are not limited only to graphs. Obviously, we can apply them to other, maybe a little bit exotic structures, such as what is called homogeneous spaces, such as sphere, or other objects that are non-Euclidean, but they have global symmetry structure. We can apply them to manifolds. So classical examples are two-dimensional surfaces and their discretizations as meshes in computer graphics and vision. And actually, there are real applications of these methods in these fields. So last year, a company in which actually I was one of the investors and early supporters called Ariel AI was acquired by Snap. So they were using geometric deep learning on meshes to create 3D avatars of realistic humans with realistic hands. And graph neural networks have recently been used for drug discovery and drug design. So last year, again, there was a paper on the cover of Cell, which is a major biological journal from the group of Jim Collins at MIT. They were using graph neural networks in the drug discovery pipeline to find new substances with antibiotic properties that could address antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And in the healthcare, this is really one of the next imminent threats. So if you've seen what havoc has the coronavirus pandemic caused, imagine that you have a new organism with high contamination that is resistant to antibiotics. So it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. So we need urgently new antibiotics that can address already existing bacteria that have developed resistance to anything else that exists. Another application is completely different kind of drugs. So antibiotics are usually small molecule drugs. Another trend in the pharma industry is what is called biologics, or biological drugs, where the drug itself is a protein or a peptide or an antibody. So it's a large molecule. And it allows to address previously unaddressable targets, such as protein-to-protein interactions. So this is particularly interesting in cancer immunotherapy, where you have receptors such as PD-1 or PD-L1, programmed death ligands, that can be blocked by a big molecule, but not a small molecule. And there are already efficient biological drugs on the market that were built as, especially as an antibody that was engineered, well, in that case, handcrafted. And if, for example, 10 years ago, if you had a certain type of cancer like melanoma, that would be a certain death sentence, not anymore today. And with geometric deep learning, in a collaboration with colleagues from EPFL, we showed an architecture that allows to create de novo designs of protein with certain binding properties. So we can design potentially in the future new drugs that can address previously untargetable diseases. So I think I will stop here. Thank you very much. We'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Michael Bronstein. And now I would like to go for a first reaction to ask Maarten to respond and maybe pick out one thing that you find particularly interesting. Your mic is still working, so you can just respond from where you are, Maarten. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Michael, for the inspiring presentation. I was wondering, how do you put some of the ideas that you've outlined for us to work in your job at Twitter? Where you have scale issues, where you have lots of very dynamic properties to deal with, I guess.
Yeah, excellent question. Well, so I can probably provide a generic answer. So some things I cannot discuss in public. But basically, Twitter, if you think of it, there are essentially two types of data assets. One of them is the content, another one is the graph. Right? When I'm talking about the graph, it's actually not only the follow graph, let's say the social network between users that is exposed publicly. This is what we see, but there are many other graphs, such as engagement graphs, such as, for example, different safety graphs that are related, for example, to different device IDs that allow to detect certain unhealthy behaviors and maybe some coordinated manipulation. So one particular thing, and well, this was actually a company that I started with my students that was acquired by Twitter 2.5 years ago. So that's how I ended up in this position. So we're looking at trying to detect misinformation on social networks and on Twitter in particular from the way that it spreads. So if you look at different stories, right, or different tweets, let's say that appear and then spread on the social network, so there is a difference between the dynamics and the structure of this propagation between, let's say, organic stories, whether stories that are fake and somehow being manipulated. And we showed that this can be detected automatically by using graph neural networks.
Okay, thank you very much for this concrete example, Michael. I look over here in the chapel to see whether there are questions from the audience at this point. And if you have a question watching from the live stream, please know that the chat is available and a selection of the remarks and questions can be dealt with here, and I will get it on my iPad. Is there any question this far? Are you still digesting all the information just like me? Well, I would have one question then, perhaps not the most expert question, but I was interested to see, like, the applications that you mentioned are all very, yeah, I would say good-hearted, you know, that they are about solving health issues and also fake news. But can you use the same, just like dynamite, can you use the same principles to do harm?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. So it's probably not specific to the algorithms and the approaches that I described here. It probably applies to machine learning in general, or maybe even more broadly to science in general. So of course there could be some nefarious uses. So with graph neural networks, so one thing, for example, that we show, so it's a recent work that I did also with my colleagues at Imperial, where we show that basically a re-identification attack. So let's take a step back, basically what context it appears in. When you have a data set, right? So it might contain some sensitive and private information. So the usual ways, what you do with it is you anonymize it, right? So you remove maybe some features that can be reconnected to users. Maybe you hash some of the user information and so on. So what we show that when you have interaction data, like for example, your phone calls, right? So if I know to which number you called and how long this call duration was and at what time you did it, right? So removing completely user information, right? So you have just the structure of the graph. You're able to re-identify the user across different times, actually with very high probability using graph neural networks. So it means that maybe our ideas about data privacy and data protection might be naive when it comes to interaction interaction type data like graph structured data, because these interactions are repeatable and predictable. So we tend to interact in a similar manner today, tomorrow, and yesterday. So this points to potential danger, but I think here the benefits outweigh the risks, because of course by describing this attack somebody can implement it, but we hope that it will be a wake-up call for people to maybe publish this kind of information or leave it exposed, that there are such underlying vulnerabilities.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael, for your answer on this question. I look once more to the audience. We have two questions here. First one, I can hold the mic.
Yeah. So I really like how you use it as a unifying framework for transformers, for CNNs and all those kind of things. But are there also things that you cannot describe in the framework? Kind of common architectures that we are using in deep learning, which are very difficult to describe in this way?
Yeah, of course. Well, so probably as a kind of with any framework or with any theory, so there will probably be something that is more of a stretch. So in the book, for example, we also describe recurrent neural networks. So I guess this covers a lot of different things. Probably reinforcement learning falls a little bit apart, even though we never really attempted to look at it. There are many relations. So symmetry. In this form that we think of it, or maybe in the form of invariance, it is probably ubiquitous in science. So I don't think that we can at all take credit for inventing something new here. We just maybe provide a common denominator. Maybe a broader approach, even more, and this was also actually something that came out of the Erlangen program, is category theory. So now category theory is being applied, for example, for what is called algorithmic reasoning, which is an attempt to marry the advantages of algorithms and neural networks. If you think of algorithms, they generalize very well to previously unseen data for the same task, but they generalize very poorly across different tasks, right? So if you have an algorithm that measures the shortest distance in a graph, I cannot use it to find, for example, a cluster or a connected component in a graph, right? But it will work on any graph, and I know exactly everything about it, right? So it's completely predictable. In a neural network, on the other hand, it generalizes kind of previously unseen data. It is not always explainable, but it generalizes across different tasks. So I can train, I don't know, a convolutional neural network on ImageNet and then apply it for as a regularization for the reconstruction of a black hole. So this, I think, this was actually used in the Event Horizon imaging data to reconstruct this famous photo of the Event Horizon of a black hole. My colleague Petr Veličković is actually, well, and his collaborators at DeepMind and elsewhere are trying now to approach these questions from the perspective of algorithmic reasoning, which is also a kind of implementation, maybe an even more abstract notion of symmetry and invariance that can be expressed through category theory.
Thank you once again. Michael, is this an answer to your question? Yes. Then we continue with another question live.
Yeah, Kees Snoek, University of Amsterdam. Michael, thanks a lot for a very inspiring talk. So I have maybe a follow-up question. So geometric deep learning is probably one of the hottest topics in machine learning today. Maybe the other one is causality. And do you feel the two are related, or does this relate to your category theory example that you just gave?
Yeah, so they are very much related. So I don't know, unfortunately, much about causality. So this might be a little bit of an educated answer. But in causality, well, what you essentially, or at least in some settings, what you try to build is a graph that describes causal relations between certain variables, right? And this is also taking an example from healthcare and biology, right? In drug design, this is something that you want to understand the biological system. You want to see how, for example, a certain perturbation affects, for example, a certain phenotype, right? Or how, for example, a certain drug will affect a certain outcome. So it's not enough just to look at correlations. You want to understand really the causative mechanism. So there are some methods, from what I know, for the discovery of causal graphs in some settings. So they are more complicated than just what they described today. They don't scale well. So the hope is that it is possible to marry them with machine learning approaches, where you can maybe have certain theoretical guarantees, but at the same time, these methods would scale better, because probably there are at least two orders of magnitude that are currently missing in terms of the complexity that and the size of the graphs that you need to deal with. Yeah, so I think this is really a hot topic, especially in healthcare, because that's where probably also that's where all the ideas of causal inference are motivated from.
All right, Michael, thank you. One more question coming in from the chat. In terms of framework/code/data available for the larger DL-aware public to explore geometric deep learning, where do you think the field stands? What would be some resources you would recommend?
Yeah, so good question. And this is actually this is what is probably remarkable and amazing about the field of machine learning, is that it moves at incredible pace. So just a few years ago, when we started working on these techniques, there was almost nothing. Nowadays, there are some standardized packages that are supported by the industry. So I should point just two of them, but there are many more. One of them is PyTorch Geometric that has actually the implementation of most of the popular methods, and it is maintained in such a way that you see a paper on archive, and a few weeks after, there is an implementation in PyTorch Geometric. So, and also Martin mentioned, for example, temporal graphs. So we had last year an architecture called temporal graph networks that allows to work with dynamic graphs. So a few weeks afterwards, after it was published, it was already part of PyTorch Geometric. Another one is a DGL, Deep Graph Library. I think it's maintained by Amazon, which is also used also in the industry. There are some specific packages, for example, for temporal graphs, for molecular graphs, so dealing with different chemical properties, so implementation of networks that are already pre-trained on molecular data sets. So there is also a standardized set of different benchmarks similar to ImageNet called the Open Graph Benchmark that is maintained by the Stanford group of Yuri Leskovitz. So there is a lot of different resources.
All right. Final, very brief question from my side. You are, in a way, a lab yourself. We have the ICAI labs where there's a cooperation between scientific institute and the practice with a corporation, for instance. You embody that in a way that you combine university teaching and Twitter. How does that benefit your career, this duality?
Well, so I think so Twitter is one collaboration. So this definitely gives new interesting problems and also a playground, so to say, to test new ideas and new algorithms. But I think in general, this is probably true. So in machine learning, we maybe tend to work on a little bit what from this canonical joke of a spherical horse in a vacuum. So we need to work with domain experts to make a real impact, and maybe the applications in chemistry are one good example. So you cannot get to the level of a chemist that works on the cutting edge of the field. You will probably need at least 10 years of education, and it's probably no use. So you need to work with domain experts, and I was fortunate enough to find, or maybe they found me, or I found them, colleagues that maybe understand the benefits and the limitations of machine learning. They understand the domain science. They understand what are the real problems, what are the expectations and the limitations in the field. And it was really an eye-opening to me as a computer scientist to work, for example, with people that design proteins in the lab. So you can have a machine learning model within a few weeks, but then it will take another year to actually do the experiments that cross the bar that is required in that domain. And it's really so it's in a sense, on one side it's frustrating because you're used to a very quick publication cycle, but on the other hand, for example, they publish maybe 2 papers, but they all go to Science and Nature. And it's really a big discovery that requires a lot of experimental validation that takes time because it's done in the wet lab.
All right. Thank you very much, Michael Bronstein, for your presentation and your answers. And please know that the applause you will get is probably only a small part because a lot of people are watching online, and those, of course, cannot make extra noise. So I invite everyone to show the appreciation to you.
Thank you very much.